Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to episode 3 of PGIM India Mutual Fund presents LiveMint, Amend, Adjust, and Adapt. This is a series of high-powered virtual panel discussions where we unravel the success mantras for the new normal and try and look at what the roadmap should be for us in a post-COVID world. I know, post-COVID world doesn't seem to be appearing anywhere in the immediate future. We're seeing the number of cases that are still rising. But it's good to spend this time trying to figure out what needs to be done for India and for the world as we finally emerge from COVID. Now, I'm Raghav Chandra. I'm the founder of Heritage. Today, we're going to be looking at the topic of policy and reforms. Now, we know that there's been an economic slowdown. We know that there's been all the effects of the lockdown, which are now over, but the virus is not going away. We keep on hoping and thinking that, yes, the vaccine is going to come, but we don't quite know when that is going to be happening. So we got to keep on planning. Some people say that there's no time like a crisis for you to be able to push through many of the changes that you would have liked to see. And I have to say that in the last 2 or 3 months, that's what we are hearing from the government. Even during the time of the economic package, the government kept on saying, we're going to try and bring about lasting reforms. And it happened in 1 or 2 areas. We've seen the education policy just being announced. So what are the policy measures and what are some of the reforms that we should be thinking about, looking at, and trying to set the stage for a faster, quicker, and a more long-lasting revival once coronavirus finally does disappear? So with that in mind, we have some really fantastic thought leaders who will be sharing their insights, who will be helping us plan what should actually be done right now. It's a pleasure and privilege to have with us Mr. JS Deepak, former Secretary Telecom, former Indian Ambassador to the WTO, just back from Geneva. In fact, so it's great to have you with us on your return in these COVID times. Raghav Chandra, former Secretary, Government of India and ex-Chairman of NHAI. Dr. Soumya Kanti Ghosh is with us, the Group Chief Economic Advisor at the State Bank of India, and a partner, Srinivas Rao Ravuri, CIO Equity at PGIM India Mutual Funds. Thank you all so much for being with us, and let's start looking at some of the possibilities ahead. But first, it's a great pleasure to welcome somebody whom I've always considered one of the most dynamic bureaucrats in the government. He's the CEO of Niti Ayog and pretty much running a large part of everything that the government is doing, not least the ease of doing business. And that's one policy which has been a priority and continues to, in many ways, be driven forward. Not least, we've just seen the new transparent tax reforms that have now just come up, aimed at incentivizing the honest taxpayer, something that's just been announced. So it's a great pleasure to have with us Amitabh Kant. Thank you so much, Mr. Kant, for joining us. Ease of doing business, obviously, something which has been very close to your heart, and I'm going to discuss various policy measures that should be required. And obviously, a lot has to be changed given what's happened with coronavirus. But I just wanted to start by discussing the tax reforms that have now just come. And I think we've discussed it often enough in the past, tax terrorism and the problem of not having a clear tax policy, the problem of honest taxpayers sometimes having to face unnecessary harassment, and yet people who should be paying taxes not paying the taxes that they should. This has been the broad problem. And I think all of this was articulated to some extent by the Prime Minister in his own speech, where he said, this is the problem, this is how we're trying to fix it. So what are you attempting to do out here?
So Vikram, 2 key things. I think first and foremost, make it, digitize, use a lot of technology, make it impersonal so that the person who's dealing with my account is not able to deal with me on a personal basis, but uses technology. And also, 2 key reforms. One is, firstly, what the government had done in terms of corporate tax, because our tax rates were high. It had brought down tax rates for new enterprises to 15% and for existing enterprises to 22%, which makes India one of the least taxed countries in the world, almost on par with Ireland. And therefore, we should, in the long run, attract a lot of investments into India. Number 2, with today's taxpayer rights, being announced that taxpayers have a right, and therefore honesty will be really the key to the future. And what it does is really that it enables individuals to get away from any kind of harassment or oppression from the tax authorities in future. And hopefully this would get implemented because there's a lot of political will to do it now. You will never have this kind of huge administrative and political will. So hopefully all of us in the future should see a lot of predictability and consistency on tax policies.
Well, obviously, the biggest advantage, I mean, some people have been asking the genuine question that, how does it help if I'm not personally meeting somebody? I guess the answer to that is the obvious one, that if you have a tax officer whom you know and whom you have to go and meet, there's always the risk of, if it's not harassment, possibility of corruption, possibility of getting some money. But for this to work really effectively, it has to be a very simple, easy tax structure with as few ifs and buts. So very few tax slabs, very few little complexity, a simple tax code, and then you can say this is what you should do. And I think the other part which is really noticeable in this, and this is something which the government is going to do, is to say we will trust you. We will believe that you're honest unless you're proven to be dishonest. Is that the approach?
Yeah, the intention really is that you should not go around opening tax accounts of individuals, but use a lot of data. What the tax department has been very successfully able to do is to get almost 99.8% of the people to file tax online. So India is one country which has managed to fully digitalize tax returns. And once you've done that, then you should be able to use this data, use a lot of machine learning, use a lot of artificial intelligence to speak for itself. The algorithms should be so based. The power of computing should be able to point towards someone who's violating or who's evading something rather than individual persons personally scrutinizing tax returns. And I think that is what is going to happen.
So I think if you really take it forward and what AI can do and what machine learning can do, one of the reasons why, if you were to anecdotally ask people, why don't you pay your taxes? Why don't you come to the tax net? I don't think they're minding that 15% or 20%. It's more the harassment that they worry about. It is theoretically possible for you, if this is the approach that you're adopting, to use AI and machine learning to, for example, say, here's somebody, that person has filed their tax return in the last 7-8 years. We've not found anything wrong with them. We've scrutinized this person 2 or 3 times. We've never found anything wrong. Therefore, the algorithm can be trained to say there's a presumption of honesty now with this person. So it's almost like once you've done it, if you're paying your taxes and you're being good, you won't be harassed after that. And then that sets into change some very virtuous cycles potentially. I mean, that's logically what you do.
No, that's right, Vikram. But there's one important point which the Prime Minister made today, that for a country of India's size and scale, we have very few taxpayers, and it's important. There's a huge onus on the people of the country that they must pay taxes. They must file their tax returns. A large number of Indians still do not pay taxes, and therefore it's incumbent upon all of us also to ensure that those who are evading taxes, a lot of people who are evading taxes must now become a part of the system. With this honest taxpayers' right, we must ensure that everybody files tax returns and pays taxes.
How do you do that though? Because the issue is there are 2-3 things. One, agricultural people who are farmers, that they're not in the tax net in one form or the other. Be somebody who's evading tax or not paying tax. You can to some extent use data, I guess, now to make it very difficult. If you're going to have to file some sort of returns and everything is going to be linked to your PAN number, you make it very difficult for someone to evade tax. Is this the approach that you're going to be following?
No, it's now possible, Vikram, with so much of data flowing in for every GST data, with your PAN card data, with your logistic data, all flowing in. It's easily possible to track out simply on the basis of good machine learning to be able to track down any evader of tax. It's so much of data is now flowing in, and India is digitized to such a great extent now. It's a very different world from what it was 5 years back. Now that between 2014 and 2018, everybody has a bank account, everybody has a mobile, all transactions are taking place through the mobile. Uh, you know, uh, everybody has a biometric, everybody has a PAN card, and therefore it's easily possible to track down evaders.
Yeah, don't evade, you'll be tracked down. And the advantage of that is that if more people are paying tax, I guess you can be a lot kinder to the handful of people who are actually paying their taxes, maybe lower the rates further. Just, Mr. Khan, now that we have you online, just wanted to look at some of the broader issues also, right? It's now been so many months since the coronavirus epidemic hit us. The lockdown is ending. Cases are continuing to rise. Obviously, there's been a lot of stress on the economy. There's been a lot of stress on startups and other areas. How do you see India recovering? And what else do you think needs to be done?
See, Vikram, the important point of this COVID is while a lot is being written every day about the vast rise in numbers, etc., it's important to say that we are the second most populous country in the world. We have the lowest death per million. We have, as a country, have the lowest cases per million. We have the lowest case fatality rate, CFR, in the world. And on Monday, actually, our CFR fell below 2%. Our total number of tests are rising. They will soon be touching about 10 lakhs a day. So that's on the side of COVID. And I personally feel that given the vast population, we've managed this crisis reasonably well. The other bit is that despite the COVID, during the COVID period, India has actually attracted 33 billion, 33 billion plus of foreign direct investment in this country. And therefore, what we've demonstrated is our great ability to attract foreign direct investment in India. And my personal view is that the vast number of reforms that have been carried out across MSME, across agriculture, across a range of areas, including coal, mining, the privatization of railway trains and the railway stations that we are doing, these are major structural reforms in the economy. The coal reform is taking place after 50 years. I was in school at that point of time when coal was nationalized. Similarly, the definition of MSME has been changed after almost 2 decades. So a huge amount of reforms, and these will put country in the right path of growth with equity in the years to come.
I want to look at some of those specific things that you spoke about when it comes to reforms, because that's, I think, a key of it. Never waste a crisis, and to some extent the government has pushed through some reforms. Maybe there are other items that are on the agenda. But on the impact of COVID, we are seeing the Reserve Bank of India, for example, talking about perhaps a 4% drop in GDP. Could be a 8% drop in GDP. Those are scary numbers. When you're looking at the landscape out there, how bad is it looking to you? How bad do you think the numbers actually will be? And do you think there will be disproportionate pain at the lower end, at the MSME end?
So let me try and put this in a perspective. It's the most unprecedented kind of a crisis the world has ever seen. When the 2008 financial crisis hit the world, actually the global growth had just fallen minus 0.1%. And everybody said there is a financial crisis at that point of time. This time, at the COVID pandemic has led to already a fall in global decline of over 6.5%. So the world has actually seen a wiping out of about 16 trillion of the global economy. 16 trillion of the global. This is the size and scale of the impact of the pandemic. And therefore, India is going to have an impact in a very big way. There's no mincing word about it. India will be impacted by this. But what India's done is, by a series of reforms, in the days to come, and by a series of measures of both fiscal and monetary policy, it is merely trying to ensure that its companies and its MSMEs and its agriculture sector stands, is in the days to come, is able to withstand this huge shock which both the world and India has seen. And that has been the attempt through both, the vast series of measures which the RBI took and this vast number of reforms which the government announced through the Atmanirbhar package. So my personal view is that we should, this year will maybe bad, but I think we should be able to bounce back next year on account of these measures.
Right. That's so, looking at the measures that are being taken, and as I said, I would like to discuss many of the reform measures in greater length, but on the possible impact of coronavirus, yes, the RBI has taken measures, and yes, a lot of liquidity was injected at the time of the economic package. But at that time and later, we've heard many people saying, but what about the demand side? What about a fiscal stimulus? What about more spending? Maybe some of that is required also. And we kept on hearing from the government, and nothing wrong with that, and saying, yes, but let's wait for some of the coronavirus impact to be over. Let the lockdown end, and then we'll come in and spend. Do you think that's something we are going to start seeing? We're seeing it to some extent in defense, for example, front loading of some of the contracts. Could we see some more fiscal spending, some more efforts to boost demand, infrastructure packages, for example?
So let's go back to the 1920 Great Depression, and that was an unprecedented crisis. How did President Roosevelt deal with it? He dealt with it in terms of how did demand come back at that point of time. It was through a series of infrastructure projects. And if you look at the government of India today, it has announced the National Infrastructure Pipeline. So across highways, across roads, across airports, the government is bringing in private sector investment. It's selling airports. It's doing a lot of asset monetization across several sectors. It's asking the private sector to come in and start operating on private trains. It's asking the private sector to buy up some of the existing highways of the National Highway Authority. It's putting out a vast number of projects out into the market. And secondly, what the government has done is put in a huge amount of resources for Manrega and in the rural development schemes of the government of India. It's put in a huge amount of resources through DBT into the hands of the farmers. And it has put in, the good thing has been that the rural sector has done reasonably well. And therefore, my belief is that the rural economy will really drive India's economy back in many ways. But I would also like to say that there are several sectors which are bounced back. You look at the FMCG sector, you look at the two-wheeler, three-wheeler sectors, they're all bouncing back. And I am a great believer that India's growth story will bounce back with a vengeance next year.
When you were referring to the Great Depression, and that's a very relevant comparison, I think, to make, because what actually got the world out of the Great Depression was Keynesian policies, a direct fiscal stimulus. You didn't worry too much about fiscal deficit. You said, fine, there is a time and a place to worry about fiscal responsibility. This may not be the time. That's what happened in the 1930s, and that's how the world recovered from the Great Depression. We're seeing some of this in other countries. India has been more fiscally conservative, perhaps, during this period than many other countries around the world have been. Is that just because we are keeping our powder dry, or is it because we don't believe in Keynes as much as some of the other countries might?
No, Vikram, I think the government has spent a lot of resources in the rural economy. The government has spent a lot of resources in putting money directly into the hands of the farmers. The government is spending a lot of money on infrastructure across each one of these sectors. The road, the rail, the highways, all these sectors. And I am quite clear that, a series of schemes which the government has started. I mean, look at the production-linked incentive scheme for mobiles, for instance, which has brought in, attracted, Apple and Samsung and all the manufacturers of Apple, Wistron, Foxconn, Pegatron, all of them coming into India in a big way. And my belief, my very strong belief is that the production-linked incentive scheme for both mobile, electronics, API, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, All of them will drive India's growth. The supply chain globally will get disrupted in a very big way away from China. And I'm a strong believer that all the leading manufacturers of the world will have a China plus one strategy. They can't get out of China immediately, but they'll look at alternatives. Vietnam is too small. It doesn't have a large domestic market. It doesn't have a very big labor force. There is no other place other than India for a vast domestic market and using it as a springboard for exports. The challenge, however, for India is that while it does all this, the states now must become very, very easy and simple. We must do away with a lot of, while we've jumped up 79 positions in the World Bank Ease of Doing Business, it's important that every single Indian state must, as a mission, become more and more easy and simple and emulate what the center has done.
So when Prime Minister Modi, for example, spoke about the reforms that are required on law, land, labor, liquidity, liquidity has happened, but the others, or some of these, as you're rightly saying, are state subjects. Some of them can be done as model codes, as you, for example, done with agriculture, which is one place where fairly dramatic reforms were pushed through. Is this something that you're now going to be pushing forward on a mission mode, talking from state after state and saying, in these crucial areas, law, in land, in labor, this is what needs to be done so that India can supplant China or can become China plus one, if that's the major goal?
So Vikram, actually the center has carried out just about every single reform that was possible. I mean, starting from education to MSME, to health, to coal, to mining. And let me tell you, coal and mining are sectors which India hasn't tapped at all. So these are sectors which will invite a lot of investments into India. But my belief is that the future of India lies to a very great extent in education and health. And, the reforms which have been carried out in education through the new education policy are very far-reaching reforms. And they will really transform in India in a very big way with school teaching, improving learning outcomes, vast range of reforms that have been carried out. And, this Ayushman Bharat scheme of primary health centers, 150,000 primary health center, and the health insurance scheme, which is covering 500 million Indians, more than the population of Europe and USA put together. These will all have very far-reaching reforms in the years to come.
So you said the government center has done a lot, and that's correct. But when you're talking about the same things that the Prime Minister, for example, spoke about, land, labor, and law, you could argue that in each of them, the glass is, yes, changes happen, but the glass is still half empty. You still need to complete the labor reforms that may be necessary. On land, you still may need to make it easier for investors to come in and find land. And laws, yes, the laws have been simplified, lots of laws have been removed, but it's still complicated. You're still, in some cases, dealing with colonial era laws and systems which are difficult for anybody to really figure out. So is it still a lot more work to be done, even at the central level, do you think? Is there an ongoing process? I think is what I'm trying to ask.
No, I think reforms, a lot has been done. A lot of reforms have been pushed very vigorously. The labor laws also have been put together in 4 acts, and they've been simplified very heavily, very strongly. And actually, they're pending. The last 3 acts are today pending for parliamentary approval. But once you have them, then India would become very easy and simple. And on the land issue, let me assure you now that states and the Nik corridor, which used to be the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, which now covers all of India, has actually acquired a lot of land across and developed land. So if you go to Aurek near Maharashtra, or if you go to Dhulera in Gujarat, you can walk into a developed plot where there's water available, there's electricity available, there's connectivity, and you can start manufacturing straight away. So a huge amount has been done in terms of land and labor both. And I think all this, because, let the COVID get over, you'll see a lot of investments flowing into India. In fact, during the COVID itself, India's got record investments while this pandemic was on. And this has really demonstrated the great appeal of India across sectors, but particularly in the tech sector. And what really the world is showing is that, and what COVID has demonstrated is really that the sectors which are really driving the global economy are the tech and the digital sector. Actually, the top 10 companies of the world, 8 of them are technology driven companies. And therefore, India really needs to make a massive leap forward in technology. I mean, today, just to give you one example, for instance, the UPI does a billion transaction a month. In about 2 years' time, it will be doing a billion transactions a day. Even today, UPI does more transactions than American Express worldwide. But in 2 years' time, it will do more transactions. The UPI will do more transactions than Visa and MasterCard put together. And India, unlike China, is an open economy. So it's the only place in the world which is a phenomenal example where, Uber competes with Ola and gets beaten in the marketplace. Or, Uber and Ola are competing, Oyo and Airbnb are competing, Google Pay and Phone Pay are competing, Amazon and Flipkart are competing, and they're all competing in the marketplace. So India is the only place which allows leading companies to come in and compete, and Indian companies are taking them on head on. And this is a remarkable feature where they are coexisting and competing. China has not allowed international companies in the tech sector to get in. And that is something which is a huge plus for India. Huge, huge plus for India.
Right, Mr. Kant. Well, thank you so much for joining us with that. And you were talking about those investments coming in. Yes, a lot of them did go into Geo, which was, again, I think a play on that digital infrastructure and the digital theme that you're talking about. Is that where you're continuing to see a lot of interest? Taiwanese companies, for example, saying, let's come and do mobile manufacturing and electronics in India, high-tech areas. Is that where, any final thoughts you want to leave us with on where you see the path in the next 3 or 4 months?
So, Vikram, my belief is that you will, we've last year seen about 1,300 tech startups in India. And my belief is that you will see a lot of dynamism in India's technology sector. You will see a lot of movement because India is one country which has, our entire GST is totally digital. Our our payment system is totally digital now. You've seen the government working is totally digital. Every transaction that we do in government is digital. So India will really be data rich. It will be enormously data rich. And now that we're using a lot of machine learning, we'll increasingly becoming a data intelligent nation. Plus the fact that data costs are very low in India as compared to the rest of the world. We'll be throwing up humongous amount of data, and that will enable Indians to find solutions to their problems in a very big way. Agriculture, logistics, dairy, animal husbandry, all these are sectors where we'll be using technology to find solutions to our challenges.
Right, Mr. Kant, thank you so much. Always a pleasure talking to you. Let me jump straight in. Mr. Deepak, you must have been hearing, during your stint at the WTO and others, this is obviously a global pandemic. So you must have been hearing a lot of things from countries all around the world as to what they are doing. How are they visualizing it? Are they also seeing this as an opportunity to bring about policy changes or reform? Or are they pretty much just saying, let's have a package, let's try and, spend our way into recovery? What are you hearing globally?
Thanks, Vikram. Yeah, wherever you look, the COVID-19 pandemic, whatever it may have done, one thing is certain, it has united the world in many ways. It's all over the place. So most governments, I think, have similar problems and they're trying to find solutions for them. If you look at Europe mostly, the thinking is that this will go away. The acuteness of the infection will go away. We may have to learn to live with it for a while till we have a vaccine. And therefore, this is a time to reset the economy so that we can revive quickly in a V-shaped kind of a growth maybe, or something akin to that when it's gone. In India, as you're well aware, most reforms have been triggered by crisis, whether it was the 1991 reforms or whether it was the telecom policy of 1999, the spectrum reforms after the 2G scam. most reforms in India have been triggered by crisis. Only few of them are a result of a vision or ambition. But today, fortunately, we have a government which is reform-minded, which has a big picture, and we have a big market. So I think this is the time to prepare. And once the pandemic is behind us, we need to quickly get up because, like most opportunities, it's going to be a slender opportunity. We will have very little time. And as it is for India, time is of essence because we need to really grow and become rich before we become old, as they say.
It's a time to make a lot of changes, what I'm hearing from you. That's what other countries are also doing. Mr. Raghav Chandra, let me get you in on this. So India reforms in a crisis, that's clear cut. We've seen some of that, and I'm going to come to each one of you and ask you for your assessment of what's happened right now and try and get a blueprint going forward. But do you agree with that basic principle that this is the time for us to be looking at amending a lot of things? Because you'll be able to get it done right now. The same policies that in times of peace, if I can use that term, are challenging to push through. This is the time when it can be done, and maybe we can look at other areas where we should specifically do this right now.
Yes, Vikram, I agree with you entirely and with what Mr. Deepak has said. This is the time to get our house in order. And I can talk about infrastructure as a case in point, where I feel that, there are a lot of lessons for us, if nothing else, from China itself. And what we've seen, those visual images of that hospital coming up in 10 days, and I'm sure it was not fake. Those are very clear pointers that we need to ramp up our infrastructure, and infrastructure not in terms of just physical infrastructure, but also in terms of our technologies for building that infrastructure. So when you're looking at technologies for building infrastructure, and that's an area where very little focus has historically gone. And while we can build highways, we can build ports, we can build airports, and all that is very necessary and important. Yet the speed at which we do that is something which we need to look at if we have to progress and achieve the kind of pace of growth that we need to achieve to make up for the deficit that has been caused by COVID and by the lag that we have vis-a-vis our infrastructure against various countries. So for instance, construction equipment is, most of our equipment today is being imported. Very little top quality construction equipment is being manufactured in India. Construction materials is another thing where we are lagging. A lot of it is being imported. And the overall need to ramp up our systems of tendering. So for instance, we've been talking of this huge thing about, traditional tendering system versus giving away the L1 and going in for more quality-based tendering. Now, those are the kind of changes that we need to make in our policy to make it more effective, we make it more robust, and be able to deliver fast. And one point there which I feel that we have missed out on is increasing our overall productivity of construction, infrastructure delivery, logistics. Those are the softer areas, while we are focusing on the harder areas, and we are managing to do reasonably well there. And there's a lot of improvement which needs to be done there. However, in terms of the softer areas connected with basic issues, we need to do a lot. So construction technologies, equipment, materials, productivity, and national productivity. Why just infrastructure, but overall national productivity has to go up by leaps and bounds. And our systems of tendering, our systems of project delivery, they need to be addressed very solidly if we have to progress and achieve the pace of progress that we aspire for.
All right, I'm going to try and get into further details of some of the points that you mentioned as we move forward. But Dr. Ghosh, if I could turn to you next. The fundamental question, like when you're looking at reforms and you're looking at changes, banking, for example, and this is an area that you're looking at, is one of the places where there's so many reforms that we've spoken about for such a long time. How do we get it? How do we get the credit flow to start moving, in a smoother fashion? What do we do about NPAs? What do we do about questions like, PSU banks? How should that work? We've heard some steps being done by the government, and the RBI has been, I think, very proactive through this entire process of crisis. They made lots and lots of changes and came out with lots of announcements. Are you expecting a lot of dramatic changes in the next few months, and should they be coming?
Thank you, Bikram. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Let me just start with a little bit of differentiation. I think we must understand that this crisis is completely different from the earlier crisis, from any of the other crises which the world has seen. For example, the 2008 crisis, because this is primarily a health crisis, which has now turned into a full-blown financial crisis, or a supply crisis, which has now turned into a full-fledged demand problem. So any crisis of this sort, we have to first tackle the health emergency. So until and unless we do that health emergency, I think we can do a lot of changes, and which we are trying to do. Some of them may be absolutely justified, but as long as you don't address that health emergency, I think things will not fall in place. The second point is that...
No, Dr. Ghosh, hang on, if I could just take the interesting point you make, and can I just take you forward before you come to your second point on that particular issue? What you're saying is more or less what the Prime Minister had said when he announced the first lockdown, that look, it's a health crisis, you've got to first sort out the health crisis. Jaan hai to jahan hai is the specific quote that he made. First, keep yourself alive, and only then can we worry about the economy. It seems to have moved from there a little bit, maybe because there's a realization that this health crisis could take 6 months, a year and a half. No one knows how long it's going to take. I mean, it's a theory that the vaccine will be here by early next year, but it may not ever be here. It's a theory that cases will start plateauing, but it may not actually happen. So can you really do it sequentially? I think that's the big question that is a very major debate in many people's mind.
Exactly. I think you have hit the nail on the head. What I'm trying to say is that why don't you use this opportunity to build up the health infrastructure? I am not sure that we had a lockdown. Now all the states are also in several forms of lockdowns. I'm not sure how far the health infrastructure has moved. So I have a very simple suggestions. To build up, India has 700 odd districts. In 500 districts, we don't have a proper health infrastructure. Now, if you want to construct a 500-bed hospital in these 250 districts over the next 3 years, it will cost you 20,000 crore per year. That means 60,000 crore over a period of 3 years. So why can't we take it as a mission mode of investing in health and education, because this is the social capital which will pay you dividends when you come out of the crisis. So this is basically the first thing which I want to know. Use this opportunity. Of course, you have reforms to do, but you need to build up the health infrastructure, because we have seen, and if we have to live with this crisis, the problem is that ultimately, initially, as you rightly said, it was a debate between lives and livelihood. Now it has become a debate between lives and lives, because the more you get into lockdown mode, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more we will have misery, the more we will have job loss. So that actually will take you nowhere. So exactly echoing your point, I think we must use this opportunity to build up the health infrastructure. And the number which I gave, I think 60,000 crore, when the total revenue of the government is in excess of 20 lakh crores, I think not a big number. So this is the first thing. The second thing which I'd like to say, correctly, banking sector, yes, the banking sector has seen a lot of reforms, but I think that we now must allow the public sector banks, or for that matter, the public sector institutions, to unlock and create value. They are creating a lot of value, but unfortunately, this value is not getting recognized in the market. So I think we can discuss this if we have time. Why not? I mean, we have done a fundamental reforms in the agricultural sector, which may have been difficult to do in the normal circumstances. So why not use this opportunity to bring down the shares in public sector banks to 51% or even below 50%? And the government can always keep control of the total the stake in the banking sector. There are examples, there could be examples of differential voting rights, where the government keeps control of these public sector banks, but let them create value in the market, because the amount of value which they can create, that is enormous, and that should be recognized by the market. And the third thing, I think which some of our earlier panelists have also spoke about, I think we need some fundamental reforms in the infrastructure sector. One of them is the power sector. I think the discoms are in a continuous mess. I think there has been a 90,000 crore program which has been issued, but I'm not sure how that is going to help, because even that money could actually not be used up properly. So we need a proper reforms of the power sector. There has to be a proper regulator to take into account how these discoms are accountable. Until and unless you solve that, we'll get into this problem again and again. We have seen Uday, now we are seeing again this guarantee. And
Okay.
with this final thing also, I think the build up the export infrastructure, there has been a policy of special economic zones which has been now pending for several years, and that
All right.
this sector is the most important creator of jobs.
Fine. I think some excellent ideas out there, and I really liked your idea of saying, you know, this is the perfect time to actually go ahead and do a lot of spending on health. It'll help you with the immediate crisis also, and is a medium to long-term thing which the country needs. So to that point, to your point, it's a double benefit that we are getting. For example, the sort of capacities that we've now built up around PPEs, around testing, may well help us in the future as well. Srinivas Ravuri, if I could turn to you next, you know, if anybody was to look, and I know you're the CIO, so you must be watching this and scratching your head on a daily basis. Anybody who's looking at what's happening in the stock market is going to say, reform, what reform? Crisis, what crisis? What's coronavirus? Markets don't, okay, I know a lot of it is Reliance specifically, but the markets don't seem to be bothering. They're almost back to where they were in February, March. What coronavirus? There's some disconnect, right, between the stock market and what everyone else seems to be feeling.
Yes, Vikram, there is a significant disconnect between what's happening in the stock market versus what's happening in the real economy. In the last 6 months, we've seen wild swings in the market. First, we were down almost 40%. And from there, we are up about 50%. When markets fell, we were relatively untouched by COVID-19 and people are wondering what's wrong with the market. And then we entered into lockdown, which led to complete halt of economic activity. And I think for the first time in recent history, we will see a GDP actually contracting this financial year. Also, we are actually seeing a daily spike in new virus cases. Whereas, you know, as you pointed out, Sensex is behaving as if, you know, we are back to normal. I think there are two reasons for this bullishness. You know, first is liquidity. You know, PGIM is present in many countries, and my colleagues in many of these places are dealing with the same dilemma. You know, markets are going up everywhere. So this liquidity is causing a rally across markets, and I think our increase is similar to what we are seeing in most emerging markets. So I think this is led by the liquidity is driven by foreign investors as central bankers pumping money into the system. Second is, you know, stock markets are about tomorrow or future, not today. You know, it's known that the first quarter would be the terrible quarter for the economy. But we all know that I think sequentially things will get better, and hopefully by the fourth quarter of the current financial year, we will come back to almost normalcy. I think that is what market is looking at, and also the fact that the long-term growth story of India remains very much intact. However, I think in the recent weeks, we have seen domestic institutional investors are actually turned net sellers. And also, we are seeing heightened activity from retail investors, a significant jump in the trading volumes from retail. I think this is a worry. Also, we believe the recovery in the economy would be more gradual. We are not expecting a V-shaped kind of a recovery. So I think this current buoyancy in the market is definitely a concern.
All right, I would like to return to some of those themes and just sort of check from you as to, people watching this must be saying, okay, once we're hearing all these sounds of reform, where do we invest in? Because if liquidity is going to keep on coming in, is there going to be an asset bubble at some point? Should you sell everything and put it into gold, as I think a lot of people seem to be doing in recent days? I'll leave you to think about that for a second. But Mr. Deepak, I mean, I don't want to come to, we've heard lots of specific reforms, and let's look at the reforms that are required in individual areas. But I want to come to you with a couple of overall points on which I am not completely sure that we've answered the question on a fundamental change that India needs to make when it comes to ease of doing business. About 20 years, I went to Davos virtually every year, and every single person whom I used to meet to among CEOs used to say, what worries us about India is not the market or the laws or the possibility of making profits of any of that. What really worries us is the possibility of something happening that you can't plan for or prepare for, which is policy flip-flops, changes that will happen, retrospective tax that will come, specifically in the, I mean, I think you handle the telecom sector. A lot of those things happened specifically in the telecom sector, whether it was retrospective tax on Vodafone or the scrapping of licenses in certain other areas. So is this a major concern that you think we need to find a way to address once and for all, that India is a country which will have a certain amount of stability and there won't be wild policy shifts that change the landscape, without fair warning?
Absolutely, Vikram. Long-term stable policies which give certainty and predictability to investors is obviously something which investment is looking for. And one of the major areas which India needs is large volumes of investment. We're talking about the stock markets. Stock markets and FII inflows is basically hot money. There's liquidity. Regulators are putting in money. Central banks are giving stimuli. So money is flowing in, and wherever the yield is good, they're coming in, but it'll go off. We need to make sure that we get investment in the real economy. The infrastructure, especially digital infrastructure, in areas like making our export sector competitive. And these two areas basically, which is, I believe, the low-hanging fruit. Now, unless we have forward-looking policies, and we've done a lot in improving the ease of doing business, but it's not enough, because other countries are competitors, and people are catching up with us, some are ahead of us. So we need to be in the race to give the best deal to the prospective investor. So digital infrastructure, which is reinforced in the time of COVID-19 pandemic, certain things which you and I take for granted is not available to 2/3 of our population. High-speed broadband for e-commerce, for telemedicine, for e-education, for digital payments, and so on and so forth. This needs to be looked at, and I look at digital infrastructure in two parts. One is putting the highways and the district roads and the state roads in the form of fiber. The other is spectrum reforms. There's lots of low-hanging fruits in the area of spectrum reform. If you look at the FCC, as late as April, they have delicensed a very large chunk of what is called 6 gigahertz spectrum, the millimeter wave, for Wi-Fi. The idea being that most of us are confined to our homes for entertainment as well as for work. We need good, stable Wi-Fi for multiple devices. You need to increase the amount of spectrum, and the US has increased the spectrum 5 times from what it was. And this will increase speeds roughly 3 times and make it go, and also fuel innovation and enterprise, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one area we need to look at. Also in the fiber infrastructure, I know the government will have demands on health and education and lots of very worthy causes, and the revenues are under pressure because of the slowdown. But digital infrastructure is something which does push the GDP, and for long-term sustainability in the kinds of times we are living in, we do need digital infrastructure. The last point, if I may, export promotion. Trade, we know, creates jobs, results in growth, and brings people out of poverty. And to put the narrative right, trade is both imports and exports. Exports are good because they create jobs in manufacturing. Imports are good because they create jobs in logistics and other areas. So the ideal case is to have lots of trade. And especially since we don't have a balance of payment problem, the policy needs to be focusing on export promotion rather than import restrictions, especially since many of our exports are import dependent, and consumers also benefit from imports. So these 3 areas, investment promotion, digital infrastructure, and looking at a few sectors, prioritizing for export promotion where we are competitive, is something which is, I think, low-hanging fruit for us.
Yeah, I think many people interpreted, maybe wrongly, but a lot of people interpreted Atmanirbhar Bharat as being almost exactly the opposite of the third part of that, where be self-reliant, don't have too much trade. And I think members of the government did come out to say, no, that's not exactly what is meant by this, but at least that's the first take that many people had. Raghav Chandra, let me turn to you on that same point. Infrastructure used to be the single biggest reason that, people, and I agree with Mr. Deepak, infrastructure is the bedrock of it, right? you need power, you need roads, you need ports, you need telecom, you need, digital infrastructure. All of this is the first prerequisite. There are some who would argue, and I think I would count myself among them, that actually India has made a lot of strides in the last 5 to 10 years or 15 years in infrastructure. I mean, power, not as big a crisis as it used to be. Roads have started to come up. Airports are now significantly better. Jio and others have come in and transformed the telecom landscape. Where I'm not still convinced that we've been able to give people an answer is that, yes, you will have stable, consistent policies that will not turn around. You will not have policy flip-flops. You will not have a situation where someone's come in and invested, $5 billion in India and suddenly the rules of game have changed. Or they've come and made an investment, the investment didn't work, and tomorrow they're having, I don't know, some tax authorities or somebody after them to say that why did you make this business decision? Some of those are factors that are actually probably easier to fix than fixing infrastructure, but somehow we've still not gone the whole hog in that. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, we have, this is an area which involves also the state governments. And we have seen in recent times how state governments have often reneged on their commitment and their responsibility towards national projects, or projects at least which are nationally important. We've seen that in the case of the Plavaram project. We've seen that in the case of the Amaravati capital region project and such like. All these, because you bring in an international company as your consultant, you bring in some international contractors. And I mean, I mentioned only 2 such projects, but I could mention several more, such as, for instance, the project for constructing an elevated highway from Madurai to Chennai port. Now, suddenly, because the government changes or some reason, you renege and you change the terms of the contract and scare away the contractor. All these convey the wrong signals for which we have something called state support agreements. But those need to be relooked at to make them more strong and definitive. And these should be vetted by the cabinet, by the union cabinet. So if a state government tomorrow reneges on their commitment towards these things, then the central government can pick them up, and it's then a disobedience or a defiance of a central statute. So there are various such reforms which need to be built in to promise the investor the sense of guarantee that he will be supported. Some of these statements that were made, for instance, may have been made inadvertently about some of the international companies that are doing business in India, that they will in any case invest in India, and we don't really want to get carried away with them. So all those are wrong kind of things. We have as a nation today, India needs to be extremely positive, extremely inviting, and must give that supportive environment and a definitive guarantee and commitment that it will respect all kinds of foreign investments. It will attract. It will be very comfortable with anything which involves the foreign investor. And today we have to ramp up manufacturing. I mean, I'm just adding to what JS said in this context, because a lot of trade is happening, a lot of trade will happen, but the key area to really focus on is manufacturing, the role of the SEZs as important industrial infrastructure. These are very, very critical, and to be able to get investments into manufacturing and in SEZs, you have to have very strong supportive policies which will not bend at the change of a government or at the change of a state government.
I think those are interesting points. Soumya Kanti, just on that point, it's not only foreign investors. I mean, if you think about it, what we were just talking about, India needs to invest in infrastructure. India needs to invest in health, in education, in power, in roads, and whatever it is that India needs to invest in. Theoretically, this is the best time to raise the money for that investment internationally. You're having what Mr. Ravuri was saying, there's liquidity slushing around. People are not getting, they're getting negative interest rates in many cases, or zero interest rates. This is the perfect time for there to be capital raising and therefore used to spend. But you're having a situation even within India in the banking sector banks are sitting on large amounts of liquidity, including that introduced by the RBI right now. But at least in some cases, it seems that they're somewhat reluctant to really step out and start lending in a very frantic fashion. The FM is having to push them a little bit into lending. What's the reason for that? Is it again a sense of concern that, okay, I'm going to invest in a project and maybe that project won't do well, and tomorrow somebody will come and there'll be a vigilance inquiry against me that why did you invest in this project and it didn't work out, and I don't want to deal with that.
Well, exactly. I think the points which you have raised are really valid. Regarding the banking system credit, if you look into, I think there are some fundamental issues. As you know that in the last 4 to 5 years, the banks actually were under a lot of asset quality issues, and also the fact is that the interest rates were at higher levels, they were not coming down. Now, importantly, the fact is that and there was intense regulatory monitoring also for the correctors, and that you recognize the assets and move. But I think you need to understand that one of the fundamental things of banking sector is that when you recognize the bad assets in the system, you should also have a resolution structure in place and a recapitalization structure in place. But you look into the sequence. In 2015, we had the recognition exercise, which was rightly initiated by the Reserve Bank. But in 2016, we set up the insolvency framework, which has been actually doing very well. The total recovery under insolvency is 45%. And in 2017 October, we decided to recapitalize the banking system. So at the end of the day, if both of these three things should have moved together. I mean, this is, I mean, even though this has happened, but if these three had happened together, perhaps it would have been easier for the banks to come out of the recognition and get lending immediately, because at the end of the day, and you also remember that I think around 11 banks at one point of time were put under the PCA restriction that they cannot lend. So it has been a culmination of a lot of things, but the good thing is that we have moved ahead. In March 2020, the banking sector has now a very healthy provision ratio. For example, our bank has a provisioning ratio around 85%, which is very healthy. But unfortunately, with the onset of the COVID, some of this could be set a little bit backward. It's good that yesterday there has been an announcement of the restructuring mechanism with defined signposts by the Reserve Bank of India, and with an incentivization that you need to restructure only those assets which are viable and not go after others. So I think that's a very good suggestion. And my sense is that banks currently are much well prepared to ride through the storm than they were in the earlier crisis. In fact, this is the story globally. If you look at the history of other banks also globally, most of the banks are well capitalized, and also if you look at the ratings of these banks globally also, they have been mostly resilient. So I am hopeful that India will come out of this crisis. And there has been a talks about lot about this banking sector asset quality going bad, you have to recapitalize. Of course, that's an issue that you may have to recapitalize the banks at some point of time. But my overall sense is that banks are much better prepared in terms of tackling this crisis at this point of time, even though, of course, there will be some amount of elevated stress in the system because of the COVID.
Right. Srinivas, just wanted to check the same point that I started off by asking Mr. Ghosh, that is it a perfect opportunity in your view, given the liquidity that is sloshing around, given the fact that the markets have all suddenly already risen, now you're hesitant to go and buy, an Amazon or whatever it is at the price and the valuation that they are. How much money are you going to keep putting into gold, although that's a great opportunity? So therefore, when people are starved of places to deploy their money, and when interest rates are zero or negative in country after country, is this the right time for India to say capital is obviously not a constraint? Let's come out and do a massive campaign of whatever it is, infrastructure building, healthcare building, other things that need to be done. This is the time to raise the money and really transform the economy.
Yes, Vikrant, definitely this is the time, but doesn't mean that the world is waiting for us to open up and invest. I think we need to do certain things.
Yeah.
And in that, as you mentioned, I think India's core advantage is availability of low-cost skilled workforce. I think three sectors that are really taking advantage of this and are already in the international market are software, chemicals, and pharma. So chemicals is a relatively new entrant. It is clearly building on the track record built by pharma sector, and also by the fact that the most multinationals are now looking for an alternative to China as a sourcing base, and I think we are taking advantage of that. But coming to doing everything or focusing on domestic manufacturing for, let's say, electronics or consumer goods and building global hubs, my interactions with the industry players suggest that I think there are even today quite a few hurdles. So if we can focus on manufacturing to take care of our requirements and reduce import dependency, I think that is good enough for the time being.
No, I don't want to understand that a little further, because that's a very interesting point that you made, that there are sectors in which India could have a major advantage, and done correctly, this could be the next wave of driving India. So let me just take up on some of the things that you said. Yeah, we all know about IT and pharma, that's been there and done that. The government seems to be hoping that we'll persuade Taiwanese and other companies to set up base out here, because everyone wants to de-risk away from China. So get them to come and set up a base out here and say, okay, make your phones out here, make cars here, make auto parts out here, and export. As you rightly said, that there are still hurdles that are there at the back of their minds. Perhaps if you could list some of those and some of the specific things that you think perhaps we should that we can try and do to remove those hurdles.
No, as I think some of the panelists have highlighted, so we are seeing more people getting interested in India to set up manufacturing, but they are still hesitant or cagey. Even if you see the labor reform that have been highlighted, they're saying that this will be there for 3 years or 5 years. You don't set up a manufacturing base, invest $2 billion, and don't know what will happen after 5 years.
Right. I think that's an excellent point. I'm just going to come to everyone on this theme that has just been raised. So Deepak, I mean, look, it's not a secret that this is a major opportunity, and any crisis has an opportunity built into it. And given the disenchantment that we are seeing with China, I think the Indian government is saying that we should try and move a lot of that supply chain out here. But I think many of you on the panel have said that just by saying that this should happen doesn't mean it's going to happen. Nor is it going to happen because we're going to say, oh, look at us, we have a big population, we're such a great country, you must come and invest in us. They'll say, yeah, we like you very much, but Vietnam is there, Thailand is there, South Korea is there, the Republic of Taiwan is there, we can go to East Europe, there are multiple places you can go to. What in your mind, Mr. Deepak, is it that India has to do? Because it should be a well thought out, well articulated strategy saying, here are the big pain points. This is what we're doing to remove the pain points.
Vikram, let me attempt to build a framework on how to go about it. I think the key thing is prioritization. Everyone agrees that urgency is of essence, and we are not a rich country. In spite of everything, we have multiple demands on funds, so we have to prioritize. And at the same time, we want long-term policy stability. The best way, according to my mind, is to look at how others have done it. Whether it's the Koreas or many European countries, they have specialized in 3, 4, 5 sectors where they have core competence. As far as India is concerned, again, we are very competitive in certain areas, globally competitive, whether it's pharma or whether it's textiles, electronic, mobile devices, certain agriculture, exports, seafood, spices. I mean, there are automobiles, small automobiles, very competitive. And these are areas which we need to build as champion sectors and ensure that companies working in these areas become even more competitive. How is that to be done? One is maybe increase market access through trade negotiations, reduce costs of tariffs and non-tariff barriers. Second area to make them even more competitive would be government support. And here we have certain good examples, Indian examples in the recent past which have happened. I'll give you the example of mobile devices. In 2015, we manufactured something like 60 million devices. Today, we manufacture 313 mobiles. The production value has gone up to 2 lakh crores from 20,000 crores, a 10-fold increase. And it was a calibrated phase-wise strategy. Earlier, it was import restriction in the sense we put tariffs, protected our industry, gave them an advantage of a tariff wall. A lot of manufacturing came in with low value addition. Then we extended it to components. And today we have come out with a scheme which is called the production linked incentive, which is what is attracting the Apples and the Samsungs to India. for huge investments, and scale, Vikram, is of essence. The stock of foreign direct investment in China over the last 30 years is $2.9 trillion. In India, it's well below $1 trillion. And in China, this investment is mostly in manufacturing. Foreign direct investment is in manufacturing. For infrastructure, they have used domestic savings, as you were suggesting. We could also try to mobilize in this time when there are not many investable sectors or areas. So to get scale, you need a scheme which is WTO compliant so that it does not have to be withdrawn once we lose a case in Geneva. It can continue and sustain. It promotes scale. It provides substantive support, which offsets the competitive advantage of high factor cost of power, of finance, and other disabilities which industry faces. And ultimately, we need to ensure that the big players come here with a view not only for catering to the domestic market, which is huge. It will initially be domestic market as happened in the automobile sector, but ultimately they should also look at exports, which would ensure that Indian manufacturers get a requisite quality, meet standards, are globally accepted. And this is what has happened in small cars. This is what is likely to happen in mobile devices, including the high-end smartphones. And this is perhaps the template which could be adopted, and perhaps the government is looking to adopt in other sectors as well.
Great. I'm going to take that template and take it around the entire panel and get you to that or subtract and make any changes, because I think that sounds like a great template of some of the ways that India can really adjust and and adapt as to the new world. Chandra, I mean, one thing which I would add to whatever it is that Mr. Deepak has said is to have consistency, and I'm sure that's sort of implied in a lot of what you said, that if you're Apple or you're somebody else or you're Samsung or you're Foxconn and you're coming into India, it shouldn't happen that we're going to come in and we're going to invest $2 billion and 6 months from now it's a new minister and the minister does something completely different and says we're going to shut it down, or 3 years from now it's a new government, or 4 years from now it's a new government that comes in and says we're going to sick the investment in the investigative agencies in you for whatever you have done, or that we will have some sort of attack. So policy stability, as you were discussing earlier, is an important part of it. Incentives are an important part of it. Finding ways that we can give them an easy way to get this thing set up would be another aspect of it. What else would you add, Mr. Chandra, to that?
Well, consistency in our labor laws is something which is extremely important, and the entire concept of the SEZs, because I was handling some of this in the state government on the other side as an officer looking after industrial development. So the entire concept of SEZs was built around trying to insulate and creating policies and a policy framework where the foreign investor would feel comfortable and which would not be amenable to the vicissitudes of state government policies. So it was a pretty robust framework. And I remember even at that time trying to change labor laws, which met with resistance at the central level. Today, we have a far more conducive environment. So SEZs should be allowed to actually have foreign investors convenient or foreign investor friendly labor laws. And also the land use planning of SEZs needs to be changed and modified to suit investment needs of foreign investors, so as they are encouraged to develop their manufacturing zones as complete cities. I mean, these are not just industrial estates like a HSIDC, Industrial Area Development Authority. They are complete. If you go to, for instance, Suzhou or any of these SEZs in China, they're complete cities in themselves. So they have residential areas, they have clubs, they have pubs, they have multiplexes and so on. So it's a complete life within a life, which will encourage a foreign investor to feel that he's almost replicated his country's environment in your land. That is what will give him the requisite comfort to be able to look in a positive way and agree to first come in for manufacturing and then to leave behind his technology to allow local collaborations to develop, indigenization to happen in a big way. Say, for instance, I was looking at the nuclear energy program in China, which is very, very substantial. It's some 50 gigawatts program. And today, 85% of the entire component manufacturing for the shells, etc., for the nuclear plants is done indigenously. So we need to really relook at how we can encourage manufacturing in a manner, while highway development, airports, ports, all that is very important. But our intrinsic mindset has to be more welcoming and ready to adapt to ensure that we get the requisite investment.
Right, setting up individual areas, with that's another very, very good. We see these areas, at the outskirts of Delhi, which are almost like a mini Japan, right? Which are, complete with Japanese food and others. Maybe we should think about doing the same with Republic of China, like in mini Taiwanese enclaves, where Foxconn and Wistron and others feel really comfortable. Mr. Ghosh, you want to add anything to that template and those panel of suggestions that were coming up and how this can be done?
No, I think I have also said the same thing at the beginning. You need to look into the infrastructure. The one more thing which I need to add is that we need to also cut the logistic costs, because in Indian context, if you look into the data and compare with the ease of doing business of India and China, India, the cost is significantly on the lower side, but from the ports, when you download the items, the number of days which it comes to come back to the hinterland, that is absolutely much more than what it does in China. So basically we also need to cut the logistic cost, and that could be done only by building up the infrastructure. The other things which I mentioned in the beginning is being reforms in the power sector, because this has been crying for reforms now for the several years, and that is one of the problems also impacting the banking sector. The infrastructure sector, we have already talked about them. And the other important thing which I'd like to mention, I think one of the panelists says, that is the National Infrastructure Program, which has been rolled out by the government, that envisages an amount of 111 lakh crores. And that envisages 30% participation from the private sector. So until and unless you make your policies attractive, the 30% is not going to materialize. And the government has a limitation, because for the last couple of years, the public investment has been significantly on the higher side. This year we have a crisis because the government revenues are not coming in because of the crisis. So ultimately, at the end of the day, the private sector will have to chip in. And if 30% is the share of 111 lakh crores, I think that's a big amount. And the other thing is that there are also need reforms in the capital markets. You need to allow these pension funds, these provident funds now to get big and actually also invest in some of the sectors. Because I think there are some regulations which has to be changed, because they cannot invest in papers or the less than AAA rated. So, and given the fact that in Indian context, I mean, that is one of the constraining factor in development of the capital market. So there has to be some changes in the rules so that we make it more broad-based. And finally, I think you asked me this question, but I want to repeat it once again, is that right now is the age of digital. We, the banks, actually are going a huge way in going for a digital lending. So for that, you have to have a comprehensive database. The government already has the database with us. For example, the Prime Minister Ujjwala scheme, the Jan Dhan scheme, the Prime Minister Awas Yojana. So all these schemes could actually be built up into a comprehensive database, because remember, India is a country of 138 crore population, and there are also significant amount of borrowers and the rural side whom you to lend to even in small amounts that can build up a good credit score, and there also lies a huge opportunity. So I think even if some of these things are done in minute amounts and the way the things have been moving. And finally, I can't resist saying this thing is that, and this also has been rolling out by the government. So I wanted to mention is that why not now bring out a comprehensive law on the unorganized labor? We had this last time this law was done was in 1979. Do you know that these migrant laborers who come to work in the states, they are driven by the contractors who just pick it from the villages. So we need to change and get a comprehensive law on the unorganized laborers, including the migrant laborers. So I think, so if we at least do 50% of the things which you all mentioned, I think that will be very good for our economy, industry, and the market.
If we do 50% of the things that this panel has suggested over the last 45, 50 minutes, you'll probably have a $10 trillion economy within 3 years. So yes, I mean, we've been hearing some really good ideas. Just wanted to ask you, on the entire point of capital market reforms that was spoken about, what would be some of the items that you would look at? And also, it's very clear that one of the biggest reforms that we've been talking about for the last 15 to 20 years was, why doesn't the government privatize? Why don't you disinvest? Why don't you, list public sector entities? It was interesting actually that the finance minister, during that economic package that was announced, one of the most major things that she said, that the government wants to get out of everything. The government doesn't want to be present, maybe a player in one company in every strategic sector. Otherwise, we want to be out of it. The question is, you need a lot of buoyancy in the stock markets and a lot of money coming into the stock markets to be able to absorb that much disinvestment.
I think the very, very valid point, but I think we need to also appreciate what is actually happening in the market. Now, first, India is a capital-starved market, and capital is essential for growth. Also, interestingly, Indians are savers by nature. And in the recent past, we've actually seen more people shifting to financial asset versus physical assets, whether it is, moving to FDs and deposits, or even unproductive assets like gold. So there is a clear shift towards financial assets. And if you look at what happened in the other countries versus where we are, we will see this trend going further. Share of financial asset will grow up. But most of this is actually getting captured in the private sector right now. As we've seen, one company raised 2 lakh crores in the last 6 months from mix of domestic and international investors. So,
that one company is probably an exception and a play on the digital themes that we were talking about.
Sure. Also,
not that many companies have been able to raise 2 lakh, I don't know how many, 200,000 crore rupees during the pandemic.
But even in the last few weeks, we have seen many other companies, including banks, raising few $1 billion from markets. However, if you see the government companies, we are talking about privatization and what's happening in the PSUs. So government companies are languishing at the same levels for many, many years right now. Not only government companies, now if you are a private company but catering to government or dependent on government policies, your valuations are extremely low. So I think there is a big disconnect today in terms of what market believes about PSUs versus a private sector which is not dependent on government. So market is willing to pay a huge premium for companies that have good business model and that have good governance. Whereas I think market has question marks on both this aspect when it comes to government. So I think what government has been doing over the last few years is doing, as you rightly pointed out, doing a OFS, offer for sale, where you reduce 2%, 5% stake, rather than doing a privatization. In stock market, short term, prices are determined by supply and demand. In long term, it is fundamental. So in short term, when we all know market participants that every 6 months or 12 months, government will come and sell their stake, and most important, at any price. Private entrepreneur is clear, this is the value of his company, and he will strive to achieve that value when he's selling. But whereas in case of government, there is no approach on, what is the fair value, how much we should derive from this entity. So as a result, most of these government companies today trading at, single digit P and, dividend yields of 5-6%, but still there are no buyers. I think that is where there is a clear need to strengthen the DOD, Department of Divestment, and having a clear think tank on how to go about. And also focusing more on privatization rather than on disinvestment of the small stakes.
Yeah. Take that big bang approach and go for it, and actually have a privatization rather than bid sales. Right. I know I'm almost out of time, but I'm going to ask each one of you to pretend to be, if you were the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, and you were sitting there and said, one economic reform that you think should and can be pushed through in the next 2 to 3 months. So when we emerge from coronavirus, we are going to be in a far more, better position. One reform or 2 reforms that you think they should try and push through, what would those reforms items be? I'm going to go in reverse order this time. Mr. Ravuri, why don't I start off with you this time? What would be that one item of reform that you would do if you were Prime Minister?
The government has no role to be in business. They need to privatize.
Okay. Get out of business and privatize. Government's announced it. Now, walk the talk, I think, is what you're hearing from it. Actually say, right, we're out there. And would they be able to, would they find the buyers if they genuinely privatized?
Definitely. I think there are quite a few people who are, lined up or who are keen to invest in India. When you see the macro picture, as you rightly pointed out, most investors, the macro story is so exciting. But when they come and start doing the due diligence, there are so many issues that they are stopped by.
All right, Mr. Ghosh, if you were Prime Minister, the one reform you would push through?
I think I will definitely take advantage of the stock market right now. I will go for a massive asset monetization drive. The total number of asset monetization which we estimated is actually equivalent to 3 years of fiscal deficit you can cover if you do it over a period of years. But without being so much optimistic, the time is now for aggressive monetization and disinvestment, and also bring down the stake in the public sector banks. I think that's a great reform. You can do that can revolutionize the markets and the economy, and you will get a bang for the buck.
Okay, interesting. Two votes there, more or less, for privatization and asset monetization as the one reform to push through. Mr. Chandra, what would you say?
I'd say accelerate infrastructure development across all sectors, no holds barred exercise, just ramp up everything. And a connected second thought on that is reform the administration and management systems of our cities, because all investments are ultimately going to be city focused. So there are lots of lacunae in the way our cities are managed and run, whether it is traffic, whether it is transport, whether it is logistics, or the basic governance structure of our cities.
Okay, Mr. Deepak, your one reform to push through.
Vikram, I'd also take the liberty and make it two. One is, of course, digital infrastructure, so that we close the digital divide and become a digital superpower, both for itself as a knowledge economy, as well as for leveraging areas like e-commerce and telemedicine and so on and so forth. And the second, I think, is attracting and facilitating investment in manufacturing, especially in electronics and in auto sector, where we have core competencies. Each sector has a moment which changes it. For the IT sector, we had Y2K success. For pharma, we had the Cipla triple cocktail for AIDS cure. This is the time when made in India electronics for the world there's investment wanting to migrate from China, there's technology willing to come in, there's management expertise available. If we can facilitate investment on scale in electronic goods manufacturing, starting from mobiles, going to components, to TVs, the entire chain, we can add both heft as well as value and jobs. And my last point would be something about patience. Reform is a slow process. When we set a policy, we need to wait for it to work. We are a country which has given the world Bollywood. And I mean, if Bollywood gives us one lesson, it says that things usually lead to if something is well crafted, it leads to a good end. There's a happy ending. The guy almost always gets the girl. But while you're at it, there's a lot of singing and dancing. And we have to live with it. We have to prepare for it. And we need not get deflected from our aim just because things may not be working in the first instance.
I think that's an excellent analogy on which to end this program. Reform in a hurry, though, I would say, use the crisis, use the occasion to push ahead with sweeping reforms across the board. No time like the present. No one's going to argue as to why India has reformed. And nobody raised a single eyebrow during the economic package on the scale of reforms that were done. If anything, people only said, why didn't you do more? You could have reformed further. So perfect time to reform, full political mandate to reform, perfect excuse to reform if you need an excuse. There's a coronavirus crisis and they had to come out with it. So go ahead with sweeping reform across the board. But then a Hindi movie sometimes takes 3 hours before the first chapter and the final happy ending, as Mr. Deepak so eloquently put it. Be prepared for that. Give it that time for that reform to actually work itself out. So some really superb ideas out there and some really, really interesting thoughts that came out during the course. So let's hope that people in the government were listening to this, because they would have got a lot out of this present discussion. We're going to leave it there for a moment, but do join us again for the next episode of of this special series of discussion. We're going to be looking at inspiration, leadership, and a lot more. Thank you all so much for having joined us.